So without without further ado, let us begin. The myth of Black inferiority. Um, as I mentioned, this is important. I like this phrasing. It's not my own. It comes from a person who I'm going to talk about. But again, it's not even educational the way I'm going to enter into this. So I'm going to go macro and then I'm going to go micro. And so it may feel interdisciplinary, and it is in that regard. But I'm going to come back to education because that's where our sphere of influence is right now. I'm curious how many of y'all have ever heard of a man named Tom Burrell? Um, if you have heard of Tom Burrell, you are in a very small minority of people because I had not heard of Tom Burrell until I was pursuing my degree in mass communications at Illinois State University. I was a mass comm major before I ended up pursuing education as a second act of my career. And Tom Burrell is widely known as the father of Black advertising. He's one of the seminal figures, one of the breakthrough individuals to first enter into the field of marketing and advertisement, not just as a Black man, but particularly targeting a Black audience. And I think that's really interesting because although it doesn't have anything to do with education, as we talk about the Black inferiority campaign piece, there's an intersection with the marketing world that Tom illuminates like very amazingly. And he has a famous quote where he says, Black people are not dark-skinned white people. And I wonder if you don't necessarily have to respond right now, but if you could in your mind, just answer the question in your mind. What does he mean by that? What is he saying when he says Black people are not dark-skinned white people? Again, for the sake of time, I don't want you to necessarily respond. If you care to put it in the chat, that's fine. But why is that a famous quote? What does he mean by that? But rather than keep you guessing and leaving you on a cliff hanging, I'm going to allow you to hear about a 2.5 minute clip from Tom Burrell himself. And this is from an interview about 5-6 years ago on NPR, where they're covering him. He's talking about his first entree into the marketing world, where he's working for a white-led company and he's charged with creating advertisements for Black people in Black publications and the errors that they're making. And he references and begins talking about a beer company at the very outset. So if you'll indulge me for about 2.5 minutes. Oops, excuse me. My mistake.
Another example was Schaefer's beer.
Schaefer is the one beer to have when you're having more than one.
A lot of brands like Schaefer's like to rely on nostalgia, thinking about the good old days. Well, for Black people, the good old days weren't that good, especially when it was before the Emancipation Proclamation.
And at the time, the line was 1856. That was a very good year for beer.
It was a very bad year for Black people.
And this ad is showing up in Ebony magazine. There's something really strategically wrong with this, talking about how good a year 1856 was for beer. And it just screamed insensitivity. It was a horrible year for us.
Robert, you can imagine just how weird this was. You got a Black guy who's working at an all-white advertising agency, and Tom Burrell is going home to the south side of Chicago, which is sort of erupting in the civil rights movement, and there are these slogans, they're the Black Panthers, and there's this idea of Black power. And, he wrestles with this idea, and he decides he's going to come up with his own slogan that's especially meant for the advertising world.
Black people are not dark-skinned white people.
When we talk to people about Tom Burrell, they quote this almost verbatim back to us. He said it so often. Black people are not dark-skinned white people. And in fact, Burrell decides to finally start his own advertising firm, really based on this principle. A black advertising agency that understood and could sell to the black consumer. Now, I know this seems immensely obvious now, but at the time, it felt like, a real slap in the face to these white agencies he worked for.
I had some reservations about some of the things he was saying.
You may remember Tom's colleague, Keith Reinhardt.
Whether or not we, as Caucasian creative people, would be able to appeal to the black audience, I felt that we could and that we had in some cases, but it was pretty hard to argue with Tom when he said, blacks are not white people with dark skin. I mean, we have a culture of our own and we need to express that.
All right. Black people have a culture of their own. They need to express that. Referring to the good old days, insensitivity. And yet we're not talking about education at this point. We're just talking about selling beer. Just selling beer. And yet this black lens of the world of history is important. It's important. It's being infused. And this predates the formation of any critical race theory. But I think it shows a couple of things there. Is that this is always how black people have looked and talked about history. And there's an intentional confusion between critical race theory and black perspectives. And when he says black people are not dark skinned, we have our own. There's black lingo, black language, black food, black cuisine, black politics, black ways of talking, black movement. That black is more than just the color of your epidermis. It is a worldview. It is an experience. And that far predates even Tom Burrell, far predates critical race theory, but that perspective is now being used as the stigma for critical race theory. Certainly it's there in critical race theory because it was created by black people and other people of color. But the difference between this perspective and critical race theory is the difference between tomatoes and ketchup, right? No one would deny that ketchup has elements of tomato in it, right? But it is not a tomato just because you see, because that's one of the ingredients. That's a confusion. That's a transference that cannot be made. Well, there's a tomato in there. It's a tomato. And that's what's happening with critical race theory is when we see elements of a tomato, the tomato being black perspectives, those ingredients are in there. That's the source. That's where it comes from. And what's happening is we're erasing black perspectives almost intentionally. But the other thing is, Tom's ads were legendary. I recall before I knew who Tom Burrell was, and transparently, these ads predate myself, but looking at older Jet magazines, black publications owned by the Johnson family, looking at Ebony magazine and seeing these like, oh, these are cool, but this is Tom Burrell's work. It's the recognition that black people have their own culture, own ways of engaging, own familial ties and folk ways and mores, and employing that. Now he's selling somebody something, so it's not exactly a social justice pursuit, but the kernel of truth remains the same there, right? That there needs to be a difference in approach when dealing with certain people groups. I borrow the phrase Black inferiority campaign from Tom Burrell because as Tom Burrell has gotten older in years and has begun to, after starting his own agency, Burrell Communications in Chicago, still in operation. I actually have friends who work for Burrell Communications, ironically. But he published a book in 2010 where he had begun to do his own research and he began to assert something I thought was really profound from a marketing professional. He said that in his mind, he began to conceive of the United States almost as a business. That the United States was a business that had been engaging in a centuries-long media campaign. And that the purpose of this campaign was actually to cement, to propagate the myth of Black inferiority to justify slavery within the democracy. He even cites the Declaration of Independence as a foundational propaganda tool. Biting and sharp stuff. And, I said, wow, this is really interesting, right? He runs it down. I mean, he literally explains and he begins to cite specific centuries old stereotypes and Black archetypes that you can see within the media. And what he argues is that it doesn't just stop in the antebellum period. You can see it through modern media. And this book is pretty good. I got it in 2010, but I thought that was profound. The Black inferiority campaign. We talk so much about white supremacy, but the flip side of that coin is this notion of Black inferiority. And this particular quote I find interesting. He says, the early American ruling class used every available tool, religion, law, politics, art, literature, even the nascent field of science as a tool of sales promotion and a PR strategy. And that framing of the United States as a business and Black inferiority as a PR strategy just stuck with me. And I think as we talk about anti-Black racism, it's a particularly useful frame. But we're going to put his theory to the test, okay? Particularly in the modern era. What I'm going to ask you to do is in a moment, I'm going to ask for y'all to break out into breakout groups composed of 5 people in each group. And I'm going to ask you all to do an internet scavenger hunt. Since you're already at your tablet, already at your laptops, already on the internet, I presume, I'm going to give you a couple of things to look up. And I'm going to give you about 10 minutes to do it. And so here's how the scavenger hunt is going to go. We're going to do what I call a system check, and I'm gonna cite Bernice King, the prolific daughter of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., because she tweeted this out the other day. I said that's a really amazing pedagogical tool to do. You know, since we have the internet at our fingertips and we don't have time to write a dissertation on these things, let's do a cursory search of some of these things. I'm going to ask you all after you break into your groups to number yourselves 1 through 5. So, like we used to do in class, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the ones, you're going to have 5 minutes and you're going to use your Google or Bing or whatever search engine you have. And you're going to search the words lending and racism. And I just want you to take a moment, a cursory glance to see what pops up. Take a glance through some of the articles, the pages, and see what you find. The number 2s, I'm going to ask you to follow suit, but I want you to search housing and racism. 3s, healthcare and racism. 4s, education and racism. And 5s, policing and racism. Spend 5 minutes on your search and taking a glance through the articles, and then spend an additional 5 minutes talking with your group about what you're finding, and for a total of 10 minutes. And if it's all right with you,
Mr.
I
Forbay,
want to
I
ask you.
interrupt for a quick minute.
Sure.
So we are using a new Zoom account through our CFRE organization, and we are just realizing that the breakout room feature is not on this toolbar right now. And so I'm wondering if there's like a workaround on this where we could have just certain people take time to turn their camera off and do this search independently, and maybe they could come back and share. Just as a quick way, you know how us teachers, we have to do, sometimes we have to adapt and adjust. And I apologize for having to adapt and adjust.
So I'll tell you what, I agree with that. And rather than us number anyone, how about folks on the other side of this, you pick the one that you find most interesting, and we'll set a timer here, and we'll reconvene at 7 o'clock. So let's take 5 minutes, and then we'll share our whole group what are some of the things that we're finding. So take a moment. You need to turn your cameras off and select one of these phrases that you want to search. Let's see what you find. We'll come back here at 7 o'clock. Does that sound fair? All right. Start now. Just under 2 minutes left. One minute. All right. Okay. So, in keeping with our work around Cindy,
Yeah,
we have a strategy.
we have a strategy. Do you want me to help you out then? I said, we're going to go through each number and we are going to ask people to either share in chat or unmute yourself and just speak out. You can unmute yourself. Just remember to mute yourself back and share. What did you discover when you typed in, for example, number 1, lending racism? So we'll ask the people who researched around number 1, lending and racism, to either share in the chat or unmute and tell us what you found.
Okay, I found that lenders deny mortgages for Blacks at a rate 80% higher than whites. And this was from CNBC, August 2020.
Fairly recent, huh? Interesting.
Thank you. In the chat, we see American Sociological Review talks about racial discrimination. We see redlining popping up in the chat as well.
I saw a few of the words that just stood out to me were mortgage algorithms, predatory lending, racism and credit scoring, modern day redlining, payday lenders on higher interest. And one thing I noticed is that most of them seem to be scholarly articles and not like news media, per se. So it's being researched, but not necessarily, reported on as much in the quick search.
No, listen, that's a heck of a job for 5 minutes, right? So there's some peer-reviewed articles, right? Maybe a few news stories, etc. Okay, and I see some folks who had some articles questioning whether there was. Okay, good. So for the sake of time, can we ask the number 2s to do the same thing? Housing and racism. Talk to us.
I had number 2, and I had from the Brookings Institute. They said that Black majority neighborhoods are underpriced by a painful sum of $156 billion across the country.
I also had number 2, and I had that in 2020, only 40% of homes were owned by Black people. And also, as a second interesting fact is they talked about when highways began to be built across the country, that major minority neighborhoods were split with the highway so that they lost their ability to function as a cohesive group and to have a sense of community. And it ended up pushing them to the side.
So interesting. I'm gonna get into a little bit of that. Excellent. So keep sharing in the chat. For sake of time, let's jump to group number 3, healthcare and racism.
I had that, and there was a lot, and just a little bit of time that I had, just generally, people of color participating less in studies on health, making an impact, and obviously the big difference in with COVID, the disproportionate toll on communities of color.
I found that there were more pain medicine is given to white people. It's an unconscious racial bias in healthcare workers. And the 2016 study found that people think that Blacks can take more pain, that their skin is thicker and less sensitive nerve endings. That was from a 19th century story that's kept going, and they're given less pain for cancer. I mean, less drug medication, pain medication for cancer, and also children's appendicitis.
And this is
Wild stuff.
Yeah, I've got a few more that haven't been covered. The CDC references inequities that have to do with housing, education, wealth, employment as social determinants and key drivers of inequities that lead to greater, more difficult health outcomes. We've talked about COVID. There's a higher rate of low birth weight babies and more difficulties in pregnancies. They have lower life expectancy. There's higher rates of hypertension, and there's higher levels of stress, anxiety, and depression, and poor access to mental health care. And I also put a reference for a book in the chat. That's a wonderful book.
Excellent. Keep it going. Number four is education and racism while we're here, essentially. So we'll assume that those are pretty obvious.
What happened?
Please share, go ahead and share again.
I'm getting a bit of a feedback. Okay. So I was asking for education. Y'all hear me? Okay. But it looks like we're going to share that in the chat. Let's go for the sake of time, policing and racism. Anything anybody has to share on that? All right. Well, we'll keep on sharing in the chat. We're going to push along here. Thank you so much for doing that. And again, Cindy, thank you for being right on the spot with the workaround, solidarity to the teachers. So that's interesting, y'all. As we talk about Black inferiority, the centuries-long campaign from a media person, and then we just did there are folks who say, why do you go looking for racism? You're going looking for racism for everything. But what we did is we essentially put a theory to the test, because if you know that something runs in your family, let's say a medical illness or a malady, it would make sense if you have a predisposition for something or a history of something in your family that you would screen for that thing. And what we did is we just put the theory to the test that, okay, we could certainly substantiate a history of racism, but what if we screen for that right now in our systems? And, in the 5 or so minutes we had, we found ample evidence, at least, that it's an imminent possibility. I would argue, like, it's happening, right? It's not a matter of questioning these things, right? And so why all the hubbub? Why all the hoopla? We're going to get into that, okay? It's a history of hysteria. This is also the history. So I'm sitting here smirking, not because it's funny, but because it's disgusting at all the things I'm hearing, particularly the medical racism, right? Black people have thicker skin, less pain medicine, the lending, that all of this is Black inferiority on a systemic level. And there's a history of these things that Tom Burrell goes through that you find in the media that show up in our systems, education being one of them. And I'm going to document for y'all how these things come into being, and then we're going to zoom out and talk about how we can get over these things and how we can impact them. There are Black stereotypes that pervade everything. And as a former media guy who engaged in critical media studies, you start to understand that these stereotypes are as old as US popular culture, and that they are innocuous, that they are odorless and tasteless, but they show up. And if you don't have the lens of the history, you won't notice them. This is obviously a magazine cover from about close to 10 years ago with LeBron. I don't know who set up the shot, but for folks who have a recollection, they know it's eerily similar to a propaganda poster from the army in depicting the Germans, right? And during the World War II or World War One, rather. And so is saying LeBron's German? No, it's the fact that, that's a monkey, an ape, rather. And that's a common archetype or stereotype when you're dealing with Black folks in the US. And it's those sorts of things that, whether you know it or not, I'm gonna give you a really quick crash course. And there's scholarship around this as well. If you care to research it, I can provide some links and some authors for you. There are Black caricatures. And I'm gonna run through about six or seven of them. And they got them for men, they got them for women, they got them for children. And they stretch as far back as antiquity. So you got the buck, you got the tom, you got the coon, and these are phrases and that you're used to hearing, and it may make you gasp. I get it, but we're gonna take it. We're gonna walk down this road. The mammy, the Jezebel, the sapphire, and the pickaninny or sambo. And I'm gonna briefly run through all of these so that you know what they are. And if you train your eyes to see them, you'll start to notice they're common. The buck has been featured in popular culture, print, media since the United States has been able to produce these things. The buck is a male. He's young. He's strapping. He's physically imposing, usually in good shape and athletic. And as a result, he's considered dangerous because he has these features, right? And the other thing is that they always portray the buck as sexually impulsive. He's driven by a desire, a rapacious desire, particularly for white women. And as a result, he's prone to violence. And so buck is valuable control, uncontrolled, must be put down with maximum and brute force, also known as the brute, right? So this is an archetype, a Black stereotype of men that you see throughout popular media portrayals. And the flip side of the buck is the tom. The tom is the antithesis of the buck. Whereas the buck is brutish and uncontrolled, the tom is meek and mild. He is docile, he's old, he's gentle, he's obedient, relatively harmless. He has very low intellect. You're not to be worried about the tom because the tom is harmless. And beyond being harmless, the tom is loyal to his master. He's loyal to the system. He is loyal to the idea of white supremacy. In fact, so much so, the tom dislikes his own kind. A common euphemism for the tom is also uncle. And you see, I put their Uncle Tom, Uncle Ben, because you may notice there has been controversy in recent years that folks have been calling woke, but really they have been informed in the way that I'm informing you about the history and deep roots of these stereotypes. That brand names, there was a whole host of brand names that my father used to tell me about that I didn't believe until I saw them with my own eyes. Uncle Ben comes from that era. As you can see here, he's depicted as the stereotypical Tom, and he's given the moniker Uncle. And so you see these characters recycled. For those of y'all who are older, you remember Disney's Uncle Remus. Uncle Remus fits into that archetype. Those cartoons Disney has taken offline. They have now been defunct because they recognize the inappropriateness of them in modern times. But again, another archetypal character. Then you have the coon or the zip coon. The zip coon is another piece of propaganda that is made to demonstrate the inadequacy of black male intelligence. The coon specifically is to show that emancipation did not work. He is a bumbling fool. He is always clowning. He is unserious, uneducated. He is a gesture, for lack of a better term. Good for entertainment, skinning and grinning, singing, hemming and hawing. For those of y'all who know about Amos and Andy, they were portraying these coon characters, lazy and jobless, shiftless, unintelligent, but again, a good source of entertainment. I'll let you rest with that. And you're starting to see it hopefully come together and connect the dots to how these archetypes begin to show up and how what Tom Burrell and other scholars have been saying has been recycled throughout history. Then there is the mammy. And before I go into the mammy, of course, you see Hattie McDaniel there, and we give all respect to her because those were the roles that were available to Black people, and she was a consummate thespian. But again, the choices within popular culture that Black people had to portray themselves were often limited to these stereotypes. The mammy is often heavyset, always portrayed as almost asexual, uh, 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 not feminine, overweight, loudmouth, sassy attitude, but only to her kind. To the whites, she is docile, she is obedient, she is loyal. She is the counterpart to the Tom. She is the head of the household because the man is absent. She is also referred to as the aunt or auntie. Yes, that is where we get the brand name Aunt Jemima. That is the original Aunt Jemima depiction that you see there. Again, American or US American popular culture, as Tom Burrell suggested, used every tool at its disposal, including brand names, including products, to propagate this idea of Black inferiority. And so it's literally dripping in everything that you see. So when people say, why does it always have to be about race? That is a gaslighting question. Anyone who's done the homework knows where these things come from, knows that they are as old as popular culture, that as popular culture emerges, the United States makes its first priority to diminish and degrade Black people. The Jezebel's another character, right? So whereas the mammy is the sassy, asexual character, the Jezebel is the complete opposite. Obviously, play on the Jezebel from the Bible, but she is young, feminine, fit, overly sexual, sounding a lot like the buck. Bad attitude, no intelligence, chasing after men, dressing provocatively and ready to fight. These are all caricatures of Black womanhood, right? That isolates Black women into boxes where either they are hypersexualized or they're asexual. They are not to be leading ladies, or they are the mistresses, objects of sexual lust and exoticism. Um, and the sapphire. The sapphire is another archetype. She is the antithesis of the mammy in that she is hostile. She is nagging. She is loud and obnoxious. She is iron-willed, and she is swift with the tongue, quick to clap back, quick-witted, but only in a contemptuous manner, who is often portrayed as bitter. And these we see in even popular Black programs and media. And one argument that Tom Burrell makes, whereas he spends most of his book Brainwash focusing on the impacts of the Black inferiority campaign on Black people internally, because we have been affected by this. I'm looking at this through the framework of how white America has been impacted by these images, as well has been primed by these. And of course, the children, the pickaninnies or the sambos. These are, in fact, and other, Caribbean or African, West African in particular, English-speaking nations, a pickney, which is a variation of the word pickaninny, is just the word you use for child. That's your pickney. That's your child. It's because it is an archetype that has been mass produced and spread throughout the globe. The pickaninny or the sambo is a child, unmonitored, unkempt, always near danger, running from tigers, falling over hills, in the mouth of an alligator, portrayed as dirty, torn clothes, immune to pain. Making the connections again about medical racism. What do they say about Black people? That they perhaps don't need as much pain medication. I just want y'all to know how deep, how baked in this campaign has been. Um, and I just gave you all a crash course on it, but these were the sorts of things coming out of Reconstruction, coming out of the antebellum era that were used to dehumanize African Americans here. And then they were used and they were politicized to deny people access to the ballot. And their denial of access to the ballot was happening at the same time that there was a promotion of universal education for white people. And the politicization of education came in the sense that if you were illiterate, you could not pass the literacy test, you could not vote. They deliberately underfunded in North Carolina the schools in Black communities, and in order that white people could be educated enough to pass these literacy tests, and Black people would not, right? Subsequently using education as a tool of robbing Black folk of political power. So don't let anyone tell you in North Carolina specifically, I don't care who they are, that education is not political, that you're politicizing something, because the truth of the matter is since public education has been around, it has been politicized. And we should note here that this cartoon, this political cartoon, Negro Rule, this propaganda, this is from the Raleigh News and Observer, right? And I know that in recent years, they have acknowledged the role of the ownership, right, and helping to spread this propaganda. But even more so, you look at the funding that was associated with Black schools versus white schools as well. These things worked in tandem, despite the fact that what we know as public education, that idea of universal public education, as W.E.B. Du Bois says, that was a Negro idea. And not long after they created it, after the Reconstruction, it was robbed and was used to disenfranchise. Other popular culture that has helped to spread this this Black inferiority complex is a film called The Birth of a Nation. And anyone who knows anything about media knows that this is actually cinematically, it's worthy of study, right? What this film did was the first blockbuster in the history of the United States of America. It was a silent film that was based on a book called The Klansman, and it was directed by D.W. Griffith. It was the first major feature-length film to be shown. But what it did is, think about this, the first movie, the priority, if that we're to look at that as a level of priority, the first thing they do is to denigrate Black people with this new form of media. And it portrays the Ku Klux Klan as heroes, and it rewrites the civil rights story. This movie is shown. It is shown at the White House to Woodrow Wilson, who then remarks that it's like history. It's like writing history with lightning. Look at this quote down here. My only regret is that it is also terribly true. So when you think about history and the role and the history laws and rules, think about this is an extension of a very long campaign, you all. I don't want us to be fooled or be misled. I know exactly, not that I know everything, but there's enough information out there. I know exactly where we are right now. There's been an attempt to rewrite this history and to portray Black people as inferior for quite some time. And then one of y'all mentioned in the chat, there's the history, I don't want to belabor and go down this, but of redlining, denying Black people of housing, writing off the areas as undervalued in such a way that the federal government will not back loans, the same loans that created the American middle class. They won't back these in the major American cities. This is Charlotte, where I'm coming to you from. They did the Hulk Home Ownership Loan Corporation created these maps for all the major cities throughout the United States, thereby robbing Black communities of wealth for 3 decades. Billions of dollars invested in this program. And this policymaking robbed them of wealth. Of course, Durham experienced the very same thing. These are high resolution copies of the very maps. And, even as far west as Asheville, you see the same exact things, right? So again, another extension. These areas are less valuable because Black people live in them. Black inferiority. And then, of course, on through the, politics of the Southern strategy. the master of which is Lee Atwater. And listen, um, I didn't block out the words here, the offensive terms. I'm not asking you to say them. In fact, I'm going to do the opposite and say, do not say them. But I want you to see them because it's the ugly truth, right? And he essentially sets up the stage that we are in right now, where he says you start off in 1954 by saying N-word, N-word, N-word. And by 1968, you can't say N-word. That hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff, and you're getting so abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And a byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. And so again, the black inferiority campaign has translated itself to something where you no longer have to pronounce these things explicitly, right? You engage in what we now call dog whistle. Now I can almost call it the bullhorn politics, but that has been the strategy for quite some time that has worked throughout the South, but it's really worked throughout the United States as a whole. So, what about our sector, education and the curricular reform movements? Hasn't there been something to combat the Black inferiority campaign? Yes, and we're going to speak to those, but also I want to point to the history of a lot of these backlash movements that we're experiencing right now. You cannot talk about the Black inferiority campaign without talking about Black resistance and Black self-determination. Because the truth is, and what needs to be talked about more, is that Black people have never sat down and taken anything, particularly in the United States. Black people have always exhibited self-agency, self-help, industriousness, and a thirst for knowledge and education. Carter G. Woodson is someone who we need to point to. We have him to thank for what has now become Black History Month, which we're entering into, but he's been so much more than that, so much more. As Black people were gaining the rights to an education, their rights to citizenship were being suppressed. So it was a trade-off. But you had scholars, educators like Carter G. Woodson, who came from the heart of the Confederacy, born and raised in Richmond, Virginia, who had been an educator, who was a scholar and author, and saw the need to offer alternative forms of curriculum, textbooks, and other learning materials that highlighted the contributions of Black people. They gave a more global and more accurate representation of what Black people had done, but also text that had been written by non-white authors. So even as far as the early 1920s, 1931, 33, he wrote a book called The Miseducation of the Negro. So Black people have been interrogating this stuff, have been calling it out. And this is a guy who, because there were no institutions of higher education who would allow him to really do this, he created his own institution. The Association for the Study of African American Life and History used to be called Negro Life and History, but that became the clearinghouse for these materials. And so calendars and so textbooks and curriculums that were created outside of the official canon. He's one of the best examples of the unquenchable thirst or desire to continue to produce knowledge in ways that honor the perspectives of Black people in the United States. And furthermore, the North Carolina Teachers Association, which was the Black Teachers Association prior to the merger with what is now NCAE, they began in North Carolina advocating as part of the public high schools movement for curriculum equity. And they pressured the Department of Negro Education to embrace curricular equity. And so in North Carolina, we see this movement, right? The Black folk have always been trying to push the envelope, but every action has an equal and opposite reaction. You've also had people like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who've been in the works doing what they do. And some of you all may be familiar with the UDC. And if you're not familiar with the UDC, this is a neo-Confederate organization that traces their lineage to Confederate war soldiers founded in 1894 in Nashville, Tennessee. And they're responsible for funding a lot of the monuments that are getting torn down in recent years. But they're also chiefly responsible for the promotion of what we now know as the lost cause ideology. this idea that the Civil War wasn't really lost by the South, that it wasn't really about slavery, it was about states' rights, and it was about you know, Southerners fighting off the intrusion of those Yankees, those Northerners. And if things were not all that bad, and that was a noble cause, but that, folks would take up the mantle, continue to fight for those things. Well, that's great, but how do they get that? How do they propagate that? They used textbooks. In 1920, the North Carolina division of the United Daughters of the Confederacy kicked off a campaign banning books. A book banning campaign. Does that sound familiar? I want us to pause for a moment to think about where we are at in the original premise that I started with about history. Book banning. They wanted to remove any textbooks that use language that they found to be disagreeable, right? Very loose and open terms, disagreeable with the perspective they're talking about. And whereas in 1920, this campaign kicked off, it seemed unsuccessful. By 1922, they had gotten the State Board of Education in North Carolina to remove books by a particular author that portrayed a perspective of the Civil War that they found to be unfriendly. But what I want you to notice is that these were white women on the front lines going to school boards and creating curriculum materials and demanding removal of books. I just want us to pause and do a thought experiment about who might be the United Daughters of the Confederacy in North Carolina right now. What organizations might we identify who are following in the legacy of the United Daughters of the Confederacy? I bet we can name names. You don't got to do it, but I'm just asking you to think about it. Yeah, that's something to think about. Folks are carrying on a tradition. They are the ideological descendants of folks who will come before them. And they need to know that we see them, we recognize them, and that we know what they're up to. In addition to that, you had movements to subvert racial progress in the form of resistance to desegregation. Once Brown versus Board of Education was decided in 1954, the power structure in North Carolina, Governor Olmsted formed a committee headed by Thomas J. Pearsall. And they created a plan that essentially provided an escape hatch for whites who did not want to integrate with Black folk. They could either take these monies and go to white segregation academies, private schools. Sounds very familiar to something. I just want to pause there. They could take their money associated with the child and take it to a private. I just want you to pause again to locate where we're at. And we don't got to spell it out because I think it should be fairly obvious what we're talking about. But I say that to say nothing is new under the sun, right? It also permitted local communities to shut down schools that they found to be resistant. And so the Pearsall Plan was another way of subverting Black educational advancement. And there's a quote from a Klan rally that actually happened, I'm told, near Charlotte, where they say, if the Pearsall Plan doesn't work, the Smith and Wesson Plan will. And it should be obvious here that Smith and Wesson is, of course, an allusion to guns, right? So the threat of violence. I'm just asking you to think about where we're at right now. Think about what's occurring, what's happening, and understand that this is why folks are like, wow, history really does repeat itself. I want to talk about a very dangerous theory, a racial theory that is poisoning the minds of the country. And it's not the theory that you have heard a lot about. It's actually not CRT, it's GRT, Great Replacement Theory. Because as we talk about what's occurring at present, we're witnessing a resurgence of not just Black inferiority and white supremacy, but a particular theory or ideology that comes out of France, Western Europe, but it's called the Great Replacement Theory. And this theory posits that with the rising majority of people of color in the United States, that they're here, there's a plot to replace or to get rid of the shrinking white minority population, that they're pushing them out and changing the way of life, and that, it's white genocide. They are effectively trying to remove white people from existence in the United States. You have not heard it called this, but you can hear the undertone, the threat of this in almost everything we're hearing now. And really what I have to tell you is it's the plea, it's the dying cry of a loss of dominance. and a perceived loss of power. These are folks who view the world as zero sum, that you are either dominating or you are being dominated. There is no living in coexistence with other folk. There is no power sharing in this arrangement. You recall, as the picture you may recognize from the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally in 2017, where a white supremacist killed a white ally, Heather Heyer, where they, where they're showing about this tiki torch saying, "You will not replace us." That is a great replacement theory. You've heard North Carolina politicians talk about how we've never in history been able to successfully integrate multiple cultures at the same time. That we've never done that. That is great replacement theory, right? The failed Anglo-Saxon caucus in Congress to preserve the Anglo-Saxon way of life. This notions and words from folks like former Representative Stephen King from Iowa talking about how we can't replace civilization with someone else's babies. This is great replacement theory. And so you need to know what it is when you hear it, because it is being used to foment and animate violent white supremacist behavior, the likes of which we've seen escalate over the past 5 or 6 years. Okay, and it prioritizes all things Western European culturally as supreme. And it's just the latest variety of white supremacy that we see happening right now in these United States of America. I want you to pause to take a breath there for a second, because that's a lot of information and it's a lot to take in. I will not leave you all here without strategies for combating this. What I need you to know is, particularly about great replacement theory, is that the folks who push this narrative, the folks who are going crazy right now, one thing they do a great job with, and you got to give credit where it's due, is consistently sounding the alarm. They do an excellent job at panic, inducing and inciting panic. We're all gonna die. This is genocide. This is reverse racism. They're trying to change our way of life. They're trying to take over our freedom. They do an excellent job. But in order to do that, I've given you history that is irrefutable. And I'm willing to, support every assertion, provide documentation for anybody who wants to, but it doesn't matter, because they're not arguing on the basis of facts. That's not where they're coming from. In order to live in this reality, one has to disconnect himself from facts. But that has always been the ethos of white supremacy and Black inferiority. It's never been connected to reality, because how could it be? You have to construct a fantasy world. And so in order to live in it, they do things like they construct an environment where Black people get away with everything, right? Well, BLM's out there looting and nobody does anything. And the truth of the matter is, anytime, college or, professional football team, there's destruction of property. Nobody's getting shot at, nobody's getting arrested, right? And a lot of times when it is, are those things, those folks are convicted to the fullest extent of the law. The Black folks are. But you can storm the Capitol and folks won't spend more than 18. It's a fake reality. Okay. Black people get free tuition. They get all the scholarships. Nonsense. If you did a cursory search, you'd find out that Black people have an inordinate amount of student loan, which is why we've been arguing for the forgiveness of student loan debt. Where are they getting this stuff from? It's not serious. It is a lie that is necessary to reinforce the ideology that they have, but that leads to a sincere disconnection of fact and bad faith arguments. And so, I refuse to take, and I would recommend that you do the same. I refuse to take unserious people seriously. That Black, people of color get jobs over white people because of affirmative action, this, that, and the third. And we know that there's rampant employment discrimination. That when you talk about the folks who lost their job during COVID, or the essential workers, the majority of those folks who work in low-wage jobs. Again, so you have to construct a false reality. So what do we do? What do white people do in that environment? I have a couple of 5 recommendations, and I'll give them to you. I think somebody has their microphone on. Thank you. I kind of open it up for Q&A. I'll send you on your way. First thing is understand the assignment. Understand the assignment. Now, this is I'm speaking AVE, African American Vernacular English here. And so I'm using some of our euphemisms. Understand the assignment. Chiefly, what I mean by that is to understand what we're trying to do as Black people here. And a couple of points I want to raise are that Black issues, our issues, are greater than blue or red issues. What am I saying? I'm saying that when you talk about Black issues, particularly in education, but also beyond that, we're not talking about Democrat versus Republican. We're really not. And there's a way in which, even from the left, that they get framed as such, that the world gets split into two, and Black people are asked which side are they on. Listen, case in point, I know it's harsh, but when we talk about school choice or charter schools, that is not an issue that Black people are going to be on one side or the other on. You have to understand that we're not going to pick a side and say, oh, I'm all traditional public, or I'm pro charter. Charters are very popular in the Black community. Why? Because as it deals with the pursuit of racial equity in education, historically, Black people have used every tool at their disposal to just get a quality education. So they're not going to get bogged down in a Republican or Democrat issue, right? Because our pursuit is freedom. That's the assignment. We're trying to get what we need. And we've always done that. We created the traditional public school system in the South, as I stated, but we've also had, private schools here in North Carolina, from the Laurinburg Institute, the Palmer Institute, the Allen School in Asheville. So Black folk have always known whatever they could. Our thing is racial equity. Whoever provides that, it's not, one can't assume that because Black people tend to vote Democratic or be aligned ideologically with that group, that we are not, our issues transcend the partisan divide. They do. And so, when you see Black folk pushing folk who are, oh, we shouldn't be fighting. Who's we, right? Like, we is anybody who's fighting for Black freedom. Other thing is, I would say, is organize your folks. Understand the assignment. There's a tendency, particularly among white liberals, and I have to say this in earnest because I appreciate that y'all are doing this right here, to not want to talk to other white folks, to not organize them. And, there are white spaces that I just can't go in, y'all. There are things that when I say them, they will fall on deaf ears, right? And so that's not my assignment. That's why I kind of hesitated when I got the invitation. But you can go in there. A lot of the folks that, yes, we may be disgusted by some of the ideas and the thinking and the worldview, and it may be repulsive, but you may have more resonance with that individual in persuading them that white supremacy actually undermines their own, sometimes, class interests, and that they might, be better served in adopting a more fusion politic, right? Organizing white people is hugely important. And that's something that I think white folks should do, not by appealing to racist sensibilities, but by getting them to see the alignment. And the other thing is no more token victories. I think the assignment is not to get some representative token, right? I think that the Harriet Tubman dollar bill is cute, the $20 bill is cute and all. I think it's great. I think that the Maya Angelou token is fine. That is not freedom. And I want y'all to know that the way the system works, the Black Inferiority Campaign, it is programmed to give Black people, and Black people themselves are conditioned to accept the bare minimum. So if we're asking for the maximum thing, we will get a token. We will get a symbolic victory. And I want y'all to train your ears so that you can help hold folks accountable to say, that's not the assignment. We want the real deal. And I'll give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about here. So we were there for the 2020 racial reckoning. We saw folk in the streets after George Floyd, the visual of that was cast on our screen. We saw a multiracial movement calling for change. When I say no more symbolic victories, what we got in return was pretty much this: painting Black Lives Matter on the streets. I asked you, did that change anything? No, but it is the sort of thing that gets offered to Black people as part of the Black Inferiority Campaign to appease us. And sometimes we fall for it. Look at that, isn't that amazing? It has not changed the way that folks have interacted, police in particular, with Black folk. And frankly, transparently, Joe Biden is increasing increase police spending and made the argument for that, despite being elected for that purpose, right? By that coalition. So I say to you, it's not partisan because Democrats participate in white supremacy too, and we are so aware of that. We're not fooled. Our issues transcend the partisan divide. When there are moments and the clamoring was so loud, folks had to respond. What we got was Democrats kneeling in a moment of silence for George Floyd. Great, great. When the time came for actually pushing through legislation, what we saw was this. We saw people compromising, watering down things that were key features of the very thing we were asking for. Because again, we're conditioned to receive the Bremen. Here, take a token, take us in kente cloths, but you won't get anything substantive. That's the way that the system deals with us. And I want you to know so that you can help hold the system accountable on our behalf. This happens in education the same way, okay? Because if we're not careful, when we start trying to eradicate racism, what we'll get is banners on the back of end zones. What we'll get is toleration of coaches and people in positions of power who do things like this, and they're allowed to resign, right? Instead of really being serious about ending racism. No more token victories, okay? Second thing, keep that same energy. Keep that same energy. What does that mean? That when it comes to anti-racism, this is something that has to be applied with integrity. We just witnessed Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and we saw politicians, we saw elected officials tweeting out select quotes, and the one quote they seem to know is the out of context quote about content and character. But even those who claim to champion equity, when it comes to applying it to their own life, we don't see the same energy. Nobody's perfect. I want to state that very loudly and clearly, self-included, right? And so we're always going to be bumping our head and learning, but there ought to be a dogged pursuit of trying to apply these things to our own life. Instead, what we got last week was folks tweeting out quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King, having no understanding or appreciation or commitment to the things, including our state superintendent, right? Who in one moment has spent the past full year participating in the anti-quote unquote CRT campaign and different spaces talking about equity without any accountability from media, right, whatsoever, but then tweeting out quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King, a man who was assassinated for taking unpopular stances. She's not the only one. There's several other folks who have participated in that, but in terms of action, one thing we could do is keep that same energy. We have to hold ourselves and other folk accountable for the things we say. There needs to be an alignment. Our actions have to match our values, right? We need to be about the things that we are talking about. It can't just be words and platitudes, because that's a very carefully cultivated way of appeasing folk. It's just resting on rhetoric, right? And sometimes we're expected to, hey, listen, isn't that nice? And I got to tell you, we're past that now, especially with the rise of fascism, right? And the book bannings that are happening, right? And the Black and brown authors that are being removed from bookshelves all across the United States, and the bills that are being passed. We need to keep that same energy. Be clear about us. What do I mean here? Us is Black folk. I wanna, this is important because as I'm inviting you and asking you in as white siblings in this work, this is not a call for being saved. This is a call for solidarity. And sometimes we can get into saviorism, right? Well, Black folk need to be helped, this, that, and the third. And look how bad things are. Let's be clear about who we are. And let's refresh our memory. Like, Black folks, African Americans participated in the largest forced migration of human beings in the history of the world, in being the transatlantic slave trade. They survived. We survived that. Not only did we survive it, we have created culture continuously, right? Over and over again. We literally shed culture, from music, from art, right, to innovations and inventions. Every single right or privilege that we enjoy now, nothing has been given to us. It is a fact that nothing has been given to African Americans at the exclusion of any other group in history. And every right we enjoy, we fought for. From emancipation, we were out there, 200,000 folks fighting in the Civil War who weren't even themselves free in most cases. the right to vote, the right to go to school, as I mentioned, the public education system. Our contribution, we have agency, right? What we just need is an assist, you know. And so we want to stand shoulder to shoulder with folks, but we don't need to be saved, right? And so that's important because even during abolition, you had folks who were abolitionists. They thought that slavery, excuse me, they thought that slavery was wrong, was cruel, was a sin, but they were not equalitarians. They did not believe in social equality. There were several folks like that, right? Susan B. Anthony being one, right? And so we need to make sure we draw a distinction, be clear about who we are, right? All we are asking for is what we are due. And when the time comes for us to be in solidarity and to ask and demand things, this needs to be the framing. Number 4 is break decorum. I'm going to ask y'all to break decorum, and what I mean by that is you got to take your shot when you have it. I'm asking y'all to not be bound by the shackles of so-called civility, because if you can rob a person of their humanity and vote to diminish their educational rights, but you do it using a quiet tone of voice, does that make you civil? If you vote to remove someone's right or to undermine someone's right to a quality public education, but you do so using parliamentary procedure, does that make you civil? I want to tell you that this arbitrary idea of civility, of decency, and of everybody wanting to get along is used as work avoidance. And if what I could really use, and I know other Black folk could, is white folk who are willing to break decorum, who in the spaces that you sit in your clubs, in your churches, in your meetings, in your classes, that you take the moment to address things when they're happening. There's nothing worse as a Black person when something happens and you expect one of your white siblings to speak up and then they don't, and you're forced to go out on a limb and say or do something at great risk to yourself, and then afterwards they come up to you and they say, "I'm so glad you said that," or I wanted to say something but I couldn't. I want to tell y'all that we are in dangerous territory, and whatever you do now is what you would have done back in the day. We really need folks to draw what's your line of demarcation, decide on that right now, what's your line thing you're not willing to tolerate. And the moment it happens, break into action, kick into action. We should be, and some of us are showing up to these meetings too. And as much as there are folks out there reciting this nonsense, I would love to see scores of white folk there, drowning them out. Some of y'all may not know who this is. This is Galileo, but I use him as an example of breaking decorum or failing to break decorum. In history class, I used to talk about this, and Galileo, what he failed to do here is he failed to acknowledge the falsity of what we call the geocentric solar system. In other words, he did not want to propagate the lie that the solar system was centered around Earth. He had the audacity to suggest that the planets actually revolve around the center, the sun. And in so doing, he broke with the power structure and was made. There was an inquisition. It was brought before a very hyper-religious environment, right? And it was made to denounce it. He denounced it. And what I say to you is, I think there's a telling example here. You don't want to be Galileo. If you know that something is true, he was placed on house arrest for the rest of his life. So if you're going to be punished, right, there's going to be reprisals. There may as well be reprisals for telling the truth, not cowering, in the face of scrutiny. This is what we need now. We need boldness, not recanting of statements that we know are real. We need to speak up. And lastly is ask who. What do I mean by that? Well, much like Galileo, I need you to center, not the sun, but I need you to center people of color. Right now, we're not centering people of color. When we talk about these issues or the critical race theory backlash, we hear a lot of things. What's clear is that there's you gotta watch for the silent white. When we're talking about people, we use general statements that are really talking about a particular group of people. We need to focus on the perspectives and the experiences of people of color. When Tom Burrell said that year was a great year, he said not for Black people. He was calling out that that was not a statement that was centered on Black people. We should ask the question. It's an easy rebuttal, just to ask who are we talking about? When you say that statement, who are we talking about here? Could you be more specific? A little soft pushback. Use that as your compass, and we're gonna leave on a couple of examples of this. Look at these headlines you've seen. Parents are against critical race theory. Parents and teachers are done with critical race theory. Don't make children feel guilty for US racial history. The simple question we should be asking here is, who's being centered in these comments? There's a silent white here that we're not putting in front. And if we're not careful, we'll let it slide through. I want y'all to call it out when you see it. That'd be a wonderful action step, so that when a simple article like this comes out, it does what nobody else has been doing. Where are the Black parents' voices on critical race theory? And this is really interesting because it says the fact that Black and other non-white parents, that is to say those parents whose kids make up the majority of America's public school classrooms, believe that the perspective provided by CRT would enrich their children's education seems noteworthy at the moment in which the battle over school lesson plans is raging. And yet, since a false characterization of CRT became fodder for conservative hysteria just over a year ago, there's been almost no media coverage examining parents' feelings about CRT in schools. The question is, who has been centered? The answer is obvious. And I'll leave you with this Nicole Hannah-Jones clip where she expertly does the same thing that I'm asking you to do. And then I think we got, 5 minutes for questions. So.
And I think it's just coming basically through a racial lens, but there's this, parents are saying, hey, don't make my kid feel guilty. And I know a parent of color is going, what are you talking about? I've got to teach reality. When do you do it and how do you do it?
Well, I think you should just think a little bit about your framing. You said parents, and then you said parents of color. So the
white parents and parents of color.
White parents are not representing. As a matter of fact, white parents are representing fewer than half of all public school parents, and yet they have an outsized voice in this debate.
So, and I chuckle at how quickly Scott, whatever his name is, meet the press guy.
And I think it's just coming.
He retorted. He was not ready. But Dr. Martin Luther King quote: "Whites, it must frankly be said, are not putting in a similar mass effort to re-educate themselves out of the racial ignorance. It is an aspect of the sense of superiority that the white people of America believe they have so little to learn. At the end of the day, our charge is to continue to learn more, to re-educate ourselves. And I want to ask that as a part of that you support these organizations, some of whom have already come before you. And with that, that is my time. We support Village of Wisdom, Education Justice Alliance, Latinx Ed, ISLA. We are Empowered Parents and Communities. Is an excellent way to start to put these action steps into practice. And I want to thank you again. We're listening.